So, a lot of older people, and quite a few younger people that are on the right of the political spectrum, normally state things along the lines of,
"What happened to free speech? Is this not a democracy?"
or something along those lines in response to being called out on certain views they may hold. And I want to say this isn't necessarily for everyone on the right. It's more so aimed at people who would hold socially conservative views or sort of old-style views, especially on views regarding race, LGBT movements and stuff like that. And whilst in a lot of nations where these conservative views are expressed are democracies with freedom of speech, the freedom of speech itself is not unlimited. Freedom of speech has many components, such as what the government deems appropriate on behalf of its people to be considered free speech. Then there's the level of public influence over what is considered freedom of speech. Let me break it down for you. Freedom of speech in most democratic nations means something along the lines of the right to express one's opinions without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty. Now, that may seem like anyone can express anything they wish, but there is also the notion of hate speech that needs to be considered. Hate speech is defined as abusive or threatening speech or writing that expresses prejudice against a particular group, including but not limited to the basis of race, religion, or sexual orientation. And I think that everyone can understand the need for this type of legislation. It's to protect innocent groups or people from views that may threaten them. But the line between hate speech and free speech is quite blurred, and that's where a lot of the hostility and ambiguity emerges. Take, for example, the Unite the Right rally in Virginia, USA, back in August of 2017. Even though 3 people unfortunately passed as a result of this protest, the group's main aim was to demonstrate their own right-wing views. Looking at it from a simplistic, narrow view, they're just there with their flags, protesting and demonstrating their right-wing beliefs. Freedom of speech, right? Wrong. The people at this rally were carrying Nazi flags, Confederate flags, and some were actual members of the KKK. Throughout the protest, these people were seen doing the Nazi salute as well. The views that these groups represent express abusive speech about various people. The Nazi flag, for example, is synonymous with white supremacism and anti-Semitism. Also, the Confederate flag and the KKK are symbols of wanting to cause physical harm to black Americans. Even if the people never actually expressed those views with words, the mere fact that they were carrying iconography that represented those views, therefore supported those views, meaning that everything they were demonstrating for was hate speech by association. From a legal perspective, the right of freedom of speech is a personal freedom. Your personal freedoms cannot interfere with other people's personal freedoms. So the second that you advocate a stance that wants to remove minorities, or at the very least, distrust them completely, you have intervened on their personal freedoms. This same logic applies to threats. It's why, even though if someone made an empty threat, and did not mean it, and just basically used their words, your words have impeded that person's personal freedoms and safety, and that's why threatening behaviour is something that you can be charged with.
But hang on!
I hear you say.
I'm not an extremist. I don't condone the views of extreme organisations like them. This is a straw man argument. I just wanted a tolerant society of open ideas.
You may say. Merriam-Webster has 3 different definitions for tolerance. One is about enduring hardship, so I don't really think that's relevant for this, but the other 2 apply as a definition of a tolerant society. Sympathy or indulgence for beliefs or practices differing from or conflicting with one's own is one definition, and the other is the act of allowing something. These 2 definitions are quite vital in exploring how to create a tolerant society. Say, for example, person X has a view. Their view is that they have no issues with the LGBT+ movement, but they do have an issue with those sorts of people getting married because of their own personal views on marriage. Sure, one could argue that person X is expressing sympathy for other views and has no issue with them and therefore being tolerant, but in actual fact they are being intolerant because they're not allowing them to get married. Because it impedes their own views, they will prevent others from engaging in a part of life. Getting married is not only sentimental nowadays, but has many legal and financial benefits that a partnered couple could use, and these people are being blocked access to that because of this one person's view. Now, if person X changes their views and accepts homosexual marriage as part of society, but disagrees with the overall notion, then they have become tolerant and are working towards a tolerant society, because they're allowing people access to something, which is one of the definitions, but also accepting that viewpoint of respecting other people's ideas, even if they don't necessarily agree with it. So they are still tolerant members of society, even if they disagree with certain societal structures. Let's break this concept of tolerance down into smaller parts, shall we? If we were to accept all opinions in a tolerant society, then that would include opinions that themselves are intolerant. A white supremacist view, for example, should be accepted in a tolerant society. But the issue here is, would the white supremacist accept the tolerant society's view? Would this white supremacist accept that in an equal tolerant society, ethnic minorities are no different from white people? Would white supremacists accept that in a tolerant society based on facts, that there's no biological difference between races? Would these white supremacists treat ethnic minorities with the same amount of tolerance that the ethnic minorities would treat them in a tolerant society? The answer is no. If you hold a viewpoint that is hostile towards others, you cannot be part of a tolerant society, as you would not tolerate them. This means that in order for society to be tolerant, the society must be intolerant of intolerance. Yeah, keep repeating that to yourself until it makes sense. This is actually known as the tolerance paradox, and it was first documented by the philosopher Karl Popper back in 1945 in his work The Open Society and Its Enemies. Although he never actually called it a paradox, he did go into a lot more detail about the necessity of this stance to protect society. It's also one of the many reasons why hate speech is a genuine crime. It is one way of protecting the tolerant society and ensuring that it does remain a place where people can discuss and have opposing viewpoints, but that those viewpoints themselves do not restrict anyone else's well-being. This actually sort of leads into the next point about public influence over free speech. There's almost a level of entrenchment on what people can say, even if it is still free speech. For example, the N-word is legally free speech. There is nothing stopping someone from saying it. But within society, it is still viewed to be very racist and is a sign of a racist individual. So people refrain from using not only this word, but various other slurs due to the public influence over how that is accepted. Another example of this public entrenchment is when you see all over social media where people have expressed various viewpoints, be it racist, homophobic and stuff like that, and they end up getting fired from their jobs. Even if they're just stating their own opinion, and it is freedom of speech only means that there will be no legal repercussions. If society thinks that you are being a jerk, then you in return will be treated as such. The freedom of speech only protects you from legal repercussions, not any other form of repercussion that society may put upon you. This leads into other aspects as well, such as when Brendan Eich, former CEO of Firefox, resigned due to the public backlash over him giving financial support to a political organisation that was against same-sex marriage. This is even though that in the USA, using money is actually seen as a method of free speech, and he was protected in his own right for doing so. The public had deemed this as an intolerant action on society, and numerous websites and groups protested this. He was well within his legal right, but the tolerance paradox kicked in. There are, of course, other factors in play that have to be considered, such as the way it affected the company's overall image, the views of the people that work there, investment, stock prices, etc. But one can argue that those individual issues on their own would not have been as significant had the company not been seen as intolerant because of this action. There's always been a divide between what's legally acceptable and what's socially acceptable. De facto versus de jure, and in a lot of cases, de facto influences de jure. Social movements pushed the change on segregation, as well as interracial marriage. Social movements pushed the acceptance of the LGBT+ movement, and now, in this current situation, there is a lot of grey as to what is and isn't acceptable, not just in terms of hate speech and free speech, but across all political issues. Also, this idea of tolerance has evolved to be more inclusive, and especially in the cases of a lot of younger people. This means that even if person X would say something more tame, along the lines of,
"I think we need to do something about immigrants,"
if it is left as vague as that, it can be seen as excluding people from different backgrounds, rather than a point about population, employment, the economy, or whatever it may be. So leaving it like that, alongside the wording, means that there's this level of exclusivity, and it is therefore linked with intolerance. Ultimately, this idea of tolerance and inclusivity is why a lot of these right-wing views get brought up and poked holes in. Criticising these views, as well as the popularity of things such as cancel culture, are not signs of an intolerant society, as some may argue. One could actually argue the opposite, in that these are signs of a society protecting its tolerance. I also think this shows that there's a higher level of empathy with people on the left, because they're more protective of other people, taking their points into consideration even if they're not there to represent themselves in person. They care about others, and it's not just their own personal views. I also think that this means that everyone should consider what they say, even if you think that you're just expressing a view and it should be accepted because you've got your freedom of speech. You should also think deeply about whether or not that view would work in a tolerant society, and whether this is just a personal view or a view that will work in a public sector.